never been so sure in my life that I was in the hands of a murderer.
It was like staring at a black hole.
Police fear a murderer may have struck again in the Southern Highlands.
But we do have a serial killer.
You could hear there was a gasp in the courtroom.
I just wanted to kill him.
Ain't kill no one, mate!
But slowly.
Hello, I'm Leila McKinnon and this is Inside Crime. Tonight, Ivan Milat, Australia's most prolific serial killer. We take an in-depth look at the murders of the 7 backpackers found in the Belanglo State Forest, the arrest, the court case, his family ties, and a secret revealed to the detective who took down this monster. Ivan Milat's face wasn't always so terrifying. As a young boy, Ivan and his 13 brothers and sisters were well known, growing up in Moorebank in Sydney's southwestern suburbs. Their father, who migrated from Croatia after the First World War, was described by neighbours as hardworking and his Australian wife, the perfect mother. But Ivan, their fifth-born son, earned a very different reputation.
I was scared of the guy, definitely scared of the guy, but it was more than a scare, it was more of a fear. He had this evil trait in him, even then, that I knew in my own heart that history wasn't going to be kind to him. I knew that history had something evil in store for him.
Paul Shipley went to school with Ivan. In 1996, he spoke about the terrible schoolyard beatings he received.
The cruel way he treated me. He gave me a beating, you know, like you get beatings off kids and you get slapped around, but he was there to hurt me. And I don't mean hurt me feelings, I mean he meant to hurt me. And he instilled that real fear into me of him. He's not bad, he's evil.
Like most of his brothers and sisters, Ivan left school at the age of 15 to go to work, forced to support the family. For most of his life, before he was locked up, Ivan worked on the roads, travelling around New South Wales.
Seemed a bit odd, you know, when we stayed in motels and that. All us, most of the crew would probably go to the pub after tea or something. Ivan never ever left his room. Others
recalled his dark side and dangerous obsessions.
I knew he liked guns because he read a lot of magazines, a lot of gun magazines. He had a knife. It was a fairly large knife, would have been, I don't know, 10, 12 inches long. With a handle, camouflage, paint on the handle. Hunting knife, like what you'd take into the bush if you were going to shoot goats or deer or whatever game you're chasing, I guess.
And it wasn't just those who worked with Ivan Milat who found him strange.
If he pulled a gun out, it wouldn't sort of surprise you, or if something sinister happened, it sort of wouldn't surprise you.
Anne-Marie Breitkopf knew him well. For 13 years, her husband was Ivan's best friend.
He reminded me of nearly like an Al Capone type fella. He always wore lots of black and stuff, and his hair was really black, and it's just like Al Capone type, you know? It's just something about him. I can't describe it, it's just there.
It still fills me with horror because I have never been so sure I was going to die. I've never felt so helpless. I have never felt so little in control of my own life. The thought that we were going to die like that is just so horrifying.
Greta Pierce and her friend Margaret are the first known victims of Ivan Milat. 23 years ago, the pair spoke about their frightening encounter and escape from the man who would go on to become Australia's worst serial killer.
I've never been so sure in my life that I was in the hands of a murderer. I have never doubted from the time he told us how we were going to die.
I had a feeling about him all the time as though there was something very wrong with him. It was almost like not like a premonition or something. I just felt that there was something very, very wrong with him.
18 years before the backpacker murders in 1971, Greta and Margaret were hitchhiking along the Hume Highway when they were picked up by Ivan Milat.
I woke up to find that we weren't on the main highway. And I said, this doesn't look like the highway. And he said in a surprised voice, no, it doesn't. Then he stopped the car. Then he said that he wanted to make love to both of us.
Well, what he's actually said was if he didn't have sex with one of us, he would kill us.
For 2 hours, the lives of Greta and Margaret hung in the balance.
Well, he grabbed me by a choker I was wearing around my neck and partly strangled me. He threatened to kill me if I tried to get away. He had also at this stage produced a pair of knives from between the two front seats in the front of the car. He took us out of the car, he tied us up. Our hands and feet were tied by the one piece of cord. It was like being trussed up like a chicken. We were leaning against a wire fence. Then he told us that he was going to kill us.
What Greta was forced to witness next is too horrifying to detail. The ordeal continued as Milat drove the two young women away in his car. A quick-thinking Greta's next move, though, would end up saving her life and her best friend.
Can you do us a favour and let me buy a drink because I'm going to be sick?
Milat took the women to this service station on the outskirts of Goulburn. He let Margaret go, but kept Greta in the car with him. Inside, Margaret told everyone in the shop that she and her friend were being held. A group of men then surrounded the car and surrounded Milat. He was arrested and charged with raping Margaret. He faced court in 1974, but his lawyer argued the two women had different versions of what happened that night. The verdict was not guilty. Milat walked free.
I'm sure he learned from his mistakes with us getting away. I'm sure that when the court acquitted him, in his mind, society gave him permission to go out and do what he did.
The morning of the 19th of September 1992 in the New South Wales Southern Highlands was an unremarkable one. But the day that unfolded would be anything but.
Good evening. Fears are growing that decomposed bodies found near Bowral are those of two British backpackers missing since Easter.
As night began to fall that Saturday, two people who'd been exploring the Belanglo State Forest stumbled on a body. The next day, police converged on the remote bush site 2 hours southwest of Sydney. And less than 20 metres from the first grisly find, a second body was discovered.
It's been covered with branches and leaf mould and leaves.
Almost immediately, it was suspected the bodies could be those of two young British women, Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. The two friends had last been seen when they went off hitchhiking from Sydney's King's Cross 5 months earlier.
One of the bodies, found southwest of Sydney, has been identified as British backpacker Joanne Walters.
It wasn't long until the other body was confirmed as Caroline's. 3.5 years before Caroline and Joanne set off from Sydney, another pair of young adventurers, James Gibson and Deborah Everest, two young Australians decided to begin their own hitchhiking journey. Despite the known risks, hitchhiking was a popular way for young travellers short on cash to get around back then. James and Deborah planned to make it to Albury, a journey of around 550 kilometres. They never made it.
Police fear a murderer may have struck again in the Southern Highlands following the discovery of two bodies near Bowral.
More than a year after the first bodies were discovered, police had found another two and suspected there were more.
What police and locals fear most is this may be a serial killer's dumping ground.
It was at that time that the alarm bells went off. People realised that the Belanglo State Forest may well have held many more secrets than we first thought.
And they were right. A month later, the remains of a 21-year-old German backpacker, Simone Schmidl, who had last been seen in Sydney's western suburbs, was found. She'd been stabbed 8 times, her heart and lungs ripped apart, her body hidden for almost 3 years.
There's 5 bodies been located, and there are indicators that there could be more out there.
3 days later, 2 more bodies. Like Simone Schmidl, they were both identified as German nationals. Anja Habschied and Gabor Norgebauer suffered horrible deaths. Anja was decapitated. Her head has never been found. Gabor was shot 6 times in the head.
We now have 7 bodies recovered, and notwithstanding that we don't know the cause of death in the present case, that we do have a serial killer.
We were not going to leave the bush until it was thoroughly searched and we were convinced there were no more bodies to be found. And that's what occurred.
7 young people, all hitchhikers, found in shallow graves, all brutally murdered, all at the hands of Ivan Milat.
All this was happening in this forest, which could have been a million of miles away from anywhere. There was no one else in there but Ivan Milat and his victims.
Of course, though, at the time, Ivan Milat's name was just another in the phone book. In the weeks and months that followed, police from Task Force Air received thousands of calls from the public. Some expressed suspicion about the Milat family.
There was a large amount of information coming in, a lot of allegations being raised, and we had a lot of research to be done.
They didn't have the computerised systems that we've got today. They didn't have the ability to formulate or collect information and then have it compared to other information. So it came down to a lot of old-style detective legwork in interviewing witnesses and gathering information, and then slowly they were able to piece together the jigsaw puzzle.
Police then began to move in on Ivan Milat. These black and white photographs were taken during a lengthy surveillance operation. Secretly, detectives spoke to his friends and workmates.
It was quite open down the yard there for 6 months that the police were checking him right out. People talk about it because they all knew him. His ears would prick and he'd sort of sharpen up at them, you know, and just say, they've got nothing on me, I've done nothing, you know.
Police learned he loved his Harley-Davidson motorbike and his semi-automatic weapons. But the real breakthrough was to come from a phone call from the other side of the globe.
That's when I decided to speak to somebody then. I just got in touch with the embassy and the Australian embassy, and they just gave me a telephone number in Sydney.
Paul Onions, a young Englishman with a love of adventure, had been to Australia in January 1990. And when he called detectives investigating the backpacker murders 4 years later, they knew they were onto something. Onions had been staying in a hostel in Sydney with a few mates. But on the Australia Day long weekend, he decided to go off on his own, hitchhiking. Onions recounts his travels.
You were wandering along here?
Yes.
Looking for something to drink?
Yeah. Oh, as I came out the shop, he says, do you need... He see my rucksack on my back, he says, do you need a lift? And I thought, oh, great, yeah.
Oh, there's the car. Bring me back in the back and we'll get going. My lucky day.
Yeah, brilliant. That's all I need. So this is where the journey starts. He looked a bit like Dennis Lilly to me.
The cricketer?
Because I like cricket. And the only Australians I'd really seen was at the cricket match. So it was a big impression at first. I thought, oh, you know, as you laugh to yourself, I thought, oh, it's Dennis Lilly.
The man that picked Paul Onions up was Ivan Milat. And Paul was to be his next target.
He became a bit anti-racial to the, you know, the immigrants who were living in Australia. He found them, you know, quite offensive, really.
You go out west and you don't know if you're in Vietnam or bloody China.
I was so happy to get the ride. And then, for all of a sudden, I thought, oh no. First go, I've got the nutter. That was my initial reaction. And then, for some reason, we just started to slow down a bit. And he just kept looking in his mirror. And if you can drive yourself, you find it a bit odd. And then I said, what's the problem, though? And he says, oh...
we'll lose the radio signal, mate. When we get this car out of Sydney, I'm going to pull over up the road and I'm going to get some cassettes from underneath the seat so we can listen to some music, eh?
Well, it just seemed odd because there was actually cassettes in between us. Once the vehicle was pulled over, and he got out to search under the seat, I thought, you know, there's two sides to your brain. There's the calm side saying, oh, you should be happy this guy's given you a lift. What are you worried about? Then there's the other side saying, hold on, there's something that doesn't feel right there. So the initial reaction to me then was, well, I'll just stretch my legs and see how it provokes him.
Why are you getting out of the car?
After all, it's a sunny day and there are quite a few cars around.
I had a good look around. I thought, oh, well, what's the problem? Surely not here, like, not in this situation. So I thought I'll just get back in and see what happens. So I got back in the vehicle and just put my seatbelt on. He watched me do it. He got back in. So I thought, oh, no problem. No problem at all. Then the next minute, he jumped straight back out and says, I'll just have to look under the seat one more time. And I thought, this is it.
I'll have one more of those cassettes, huh?
So, he just bent over, looked under the seat, and just pulled out a revolver. And obviously, all the questions was answered in one movement.
You know what this is? Easy, what's wrong, man?
After a desperate struggle, Onions managed to free himself from Milat's car and dodged a shot fired at his back. Thanks to a passing driver, Onions escaped and made it to a nearby police station. The British tourist reported the incident to the officer on duty. The trouble is, that's where the information stayed. At the time, police had no reason to suspect Ivan Milat, or anyone else, mind you, of any similar crimes. It would be 2 years before the first bodies were found in Belanglo State Forest, just a short distance from where Paul Onions was almost killed. Onions was flown back to Sydney. He was shown a series of photos and identified Ivan Milat straight away.
Went through all the pictures, and that was the one that gave me initial reaction. It made me uneasy when I looked at it. And then when I looked closer, I said to him, that's the person who I think I met that day.
There were a huge amount of potential pieces to the puzzle, and the matter was going through and searching and identifying what was relevant and what wasn't. The Paul Onions matter was, if you like, the icing on the cake.
Ivan Milat became suspect number one.
In simultaneous raids, they struck across the country. Up to 300 heavily armed police readied themselves for the swoop.
Early on the morning of the 22nd of May 1994, Australia's largest police investigation was preparing for its most significant day yet.
A select group of journalists were invited to a briefing by the task force chief, and that was to inform us that there would be raids carried out the next morning, early. We were asked not to publicise that information at that stage because it would jeopardise the investigation.
So it was a very complex time, a very difficult time, and one of the issues was making the strategic decision of do we search the Milat properties and look at Ivan and the other brothers as well, or do we hold off? If we're going in, when do we go in and how do we go in?
With military-style precision, up to 300 officers were called into action. Their mission, to catch Ivan Milat.
You had tactical operations police, you had dog squad, heavily armed police, forensic police. It was then that I realised that this was really a monumental stage, a turning point in this investigation.
After the pre-dawn briefing, teams of police were sent out from here at Campbelltown Police Station. Their targets, 3 separate addresses in the southwestern Sydney area.
It was very stressful because we didn't know what we were going to find or how we were going to respond to it if we did find it.
The main target in this morning's raid, a house just behind me here in Cinnabar Street at Eaglevale.
Just after 6:30 a.m, the phone rang in Ivan Milat's house, which was surrounded by armed police. A lead negotiator told him to surrender, but Milat thought it was a prank. After being convinced that there was nowhere to run, he finally handed himself over. Milat was arrested.
Neighbours were stunned by the morning's raid.
They had the next door neighbour out on the ground, had a shotgun to his head.
From the moment we got in, police started noticing things that were, to say the least, a bit unusual.
At the time, though, Clive Small needed to keep his cards close to his chest.
No, I've got no comment on any aspect of the operation at this stage.
Because at this point, it wasn't the backpacker murders police had arrested Milat for. At least, not yet.
As I understand it, so far no charges have been laid in connection with the 7 backpacker murders. Do police really believe they're close to a breakthrough in this case?
They're remaining very tight-lipped, Jim.
The rationale for the arrest was simply this. We've got a substantial amount of evidence which tends to suggest at this stage that Ivan was the backpacker killer, but it wasn't 100%. What we did have was Paul Onion's evidence, which gave us enough to charge Ivan Milat with the attempted murder of Paul Onions.
Although they were certain they had their man, police now needed the evidence to prove it, charge him, and convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt that Milat was the man responsible. Not just for the attempted murder of Paul Onions, but for the 7 backpacker killings. In the days following his arrest, police tore Milat's house apart. What they found was astounding.
We had rope plastic strips that could secure your wrists, property and camping equipment found in the garage, which adjoined the house. During a search of the roof of the house, police found parts of a weapon used to kill a number of the victims, hidden between the wall of the house and the brick wall of the garage.
They had stumbled upon the Aladdin's Cave of this case.
Backpacking gear, knives, guns, and hidden in a wall cavity, a Ruger rifle. And the search for clues didn't stop there. Hundreds of officers were also busy combing through dense bushland in the Belanglo Forest and at other properties owned by members of the Milat family.
What we also found was that one of the Milat homes, which was on a property, in fact had a firing range. And we carried out a search of the firing range, which was no simple job either, because there had been a big mound built at the end of the range and shots were being fired down into it. So part of that mound had to be pulled apart and bullets were found everywhere. Shells were found around the range from quite a lot of different weapons. They all had to be examined.
There they found spent cartridges and bullets. The ballistics team took the Ruger bolt, found at Milat's house and fitted it to similar rifles. They fired hundreds of shots. Then, using a powerful microscope, they compared these cartridges and bullets to those found at the scene of the murders. They matched. As police continued their painstaking search for evidence, the families of the 7 murdered backpackers waited for answers. Pressure was growing on police to find the evidence they needed to charge Milat with the crimes. Although they were certain they had their man, police now needed the evidence to prove it, charge him, and convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt that Milat was the man responsible. Spearheading the prosecution case was Queen's Counsel Ian Lloyd. In 1996, he recalled Milat's first day in court 2 years earlier.
From memory, the atmosphere of the court was quite tense. To use the colloquialism, you could have cut the atmosphere with a knife. Tension
soon turned to triumph, though, as the weight of evidence piled up against Milat.
I vividly recall asking Paul Onions to look around the courtroom and see if he could identify the person who had abducted him and shot at him on the Hume Highway. He looked around the courtroom, looked at Ivan Milat, and without hesitation said, "That man was the man who attempted to kill me."
Ivan Milat charged with the 7 backpacker murders.
I've got this recollection of that van being driven out and him yelling from inside that he was innocent. He didn't know what was going on.
Oh shit, mate. I didn't kill no one. I didn't kill no one, mate.
Throughout it all, Milat maintained his innocence. For the parents of Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, James Gibson and Deborah Everest, Anja Habschmied and Gabor Norgebauer, and Simone Schmidl, the days since their children's disappearance had been painful and painfully frustrating. Remember, they'd been waiting up to 4.5 years for answers before Ivan Milat was eventually arrested and charged with murdering their young loved ones in what should have been the happiest days of their lives.
You've deprived someone of the greatest gift that they could ever have, life.
Almost 2.5 years after the last body was discovered in the Belanglo Forest, evidence has begun in the backpacker murder trial.
The trial of Ivan Milat began in the New South Wales Supreme Court on March the 26th, 1996. For 15 weeks, a jury of 8 men and 4 women heard from hundreds of witnesses. The families of the victims in court for it all.
It was very important for the families of all the victims to be there. They'd suffered so much at the hands of this man, and they, I think, wanted to ensure that justice was being done, not just being seen to be done.
He wouldn't look at us at all. I just wanted to kill him. But slowly.
After painstaking work by police, finding and linking evidence at Milat's home and the crime scenes to him and his victims, it was now up to the Crown Prosecutor, Mark Tedeschi, to convince the jury, beyond reasonable doubt, that police had the right man. It wasn't an easy task or a small one.
We knew that it was going to be a very long, complicated and trying period.
There was the Ruger rifle found concealed in a wall cavity at Milat's house that ballistics experts could trace to the scene of the murders. Then there was the scratched water bottle also found at Milat's home, which testing with infrared cameras showed once had the word Simi carved into it, Simone Schmidl's nickname. Milat showed little emotion as he sat in the dock. He took notes and was careful not to smile at the jury.
If you looked into his eyes, and I've looked into his eyes a couple of times, there was nothing there. It was like staring at a black hole.
Throughout the entire proceedings, his defence team argued that there was no proof that he was guilty. They called Milat's girlfriend, Shalinda Hughes, in the hope that she could convince the jury that the man she loved couldn't have committed such terrible crimes. But it backfired.
The Crown Prosecutor, Mark Tedeschi, had a reputation for being meticulous. The way he presented evidence and the timing of that was crucial in any case that he prosecuted. And when he produced the photograph of Milat's girlfriend wearing the top, which is believed to have been Caroline Clark's, because it was exactly the same, you could hear there was a gasp in the courtroom.
It was the stuff courtroom dramas are made of.
I think Ivan Milat fell into a serial killer trait. They like to keep trophies, and they keep those trophies because it's a reminder to them of the power they had over their victims. It's also a reminder to them of what they did. And while they can leave them for anyone to see, only the serial killer will know the meaning. They'll know that that was their trophy from killing somebody.
Even as the evidence piled up, Milat remained defiant. He argued he was framed, the evidence planted to shift the guilt onto him. During the trial, Ivan's brother Richard took the stand, while outside court, another of the Milat brothers, William, took aim at a photographer. And in the final days of the trial, a third Milat brother's name was raised, Walter. The defence team, in a last-ditch bid, tried to cast a shadow of doubt over the whole prosecution case. They said the killer had to be one of the Milat family. But which one? Ivan, Richard, or Walter? All three said they had nothing to do with the murders.
4 months after the hearing began, the jury in the backpacker murder trial of Ivan Milat retired this afternoon.
For 3 days, the jury considered its verdict. Would Ivan Milat, the 51-year-old former road worker who, as a schoolboy, violently terrorised his peers, who, as a young man, seemingly got away with kidnapping 2 helpless women, raping one of them, be found guilty of attempting to murder backpacker Paul Onions and go on to killing 7 other young travellers in the Belanglo State Forest?
Ivan Milat guilty in the backpacker murder trial.
It was a huge relief, to say the least.
It left everyone breathless because here we had Australia's worst ever serial killer convicted of Australia's worst ever serial killings.
There was an appeal and an attempted appeal, both of which ultimately failed. Ivan Milat was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, 18 years of them, without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence which would certainly mean the backpacker killer would spend the rest of his life behind bars.
We've stopped the murders. There won't be any more.
Most would have hoped these pictures of Ivan Milat would have been the last we'd see of him. But this monster was intent on haunting Australia for many years to come.
Police weren't taking any chances with one of the state's most dangerous criminals. Milat escorted to the inquest under heavy guard.
In 2001, 5 years after he was sent away to prison for life, Ivan Milat was let out, but not as a free man.
Milat has been named as one of the main suspects in the murders of Leanne Goodall, Robin Hickey and schoolgirl Amanda Robinson.
Many have long suspected the 7 murders committed by Ivan Milat weren't his only ones. Despite various inquests and inquiries, Milat was never charged with any further crimes. But there is one crime that those closest to the backpacker murders investigation say had all his hallmarks.
Police today mounted a bush search, not at the Belanglo State Forest, but some 200 kilometres away.
Peter Letcher was on his way home to Bathurst from Sydney's southwest when he disappeared in November 1987. The 18-year-old's body was found in a bush grave covered in leaves and branches in the Belanglo State Forest. He'd been shot several times in the head.
I've got no doubt that Ivan murdered Peter Letcher. There are 2 other unsolved murders of young women that occurred in the very early 70s, which I believe Ivan could well have been involved in and could be the murderer, but there was no evidence to prove it except the similarities of the disappearance.
The other lingering question has always been, did Ivan Milat really act alone when he committed the 7 backpacker murders? On this, Clive Small is equally certain. He did.
First of all, there's the Paul Onions case, where Paul Onions says Ivan was acting alone, and he describes Ivan's car. Secondly, the fact that Ivan had control of all the property belonging to the victims and had given it to his family, no suggestion anyone else had.
To the very end, publicly at least, Ivan Milat maintained his innocence.
Do you think that you know who may be responsible?
No, I got no idea. You know, I can think of all sorts of things, but no, not really.
Ivan's family believed him, insisting he'd been framed all along.
It upsets me the fact that he hasn't had a chance to have a retrial.
We do have a serial killer.
For Clive Small, there's no disputing Milat's guilt.
In 2005, following my retirement from the police, I went down to Goulburn Supermax. While we were walking through there, next minute there was some yelling out to the corrective service officer that we were with. And when we looked around to see who it was Ivan had his head part way out through the door yelling. And I thought, well, this is very interesting, and he wanted to see the corrective service officer. He was then giving that officer a bit of a mouthful because he hadn't been getting what he wanted. Part way through that carrying on, he looked at me and then said, "Hey, I know you. You're Clive Small." And I said, "Yes." "So what?" He said, "Well, why are you saying that my sister was involved in the murders when she wasn't?" And he went on a bit. But I said, "I've never said that." He said, "Yes, you have." I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Yes, you have, you and my solicitor." He said, "You're both saying that she was involved." I said, "No, I haven't said she was involved because I know that you did it and you did it alone." He said, "Yes. So why are you saying she's involved?" And once he said it, he realised what he'd said. It was the first thing and the only admission, if you like, I'd heard him say. But by that time, he was well and truly convicted and serving a fair stack of his sentence in jail. But it gave me a deal of satisfaction, I can tell you.
Backpacker serial killer Ivan Milat is carrying out a bizarre prison cell protest, which includes swallowing razor blades.
Ivan Milat has been behind bars for 20 years over the backpacker murders, but he's been writing to one of his nephews, relentlessly declaring his innocence.
Serial killer Ivan Milat is back behind bars after cutting off his little finger.
Goulburn Supermax prison is a terrible place for terrible people. It's here that Ivan Milat spent much of the past 2 decades. He was one of this high-security facility's first residents, an honour befitting the man he was. When Ivan Milat was taken from here to Sydney's Prince of Wales Hospital, we learned that he had terminal cancer of the esophagus and stomach. He would never return to his Supermax cell, instead being taken to the hospital wing at Long Bay Jail to see out his days. Now, Ivan Milat is dead.
I feel there's a sense of warped satisfaction in the sense that he's not going to kill anyone. He's not costing us any more money by holding him in jail.
Ivan Milat has taken his evil motive and his evil secrets to the grave, never having truly answered the eternal question, Why?
Well, I would like to think, as he meets his maker, he will be in for a very hard time.
He deserves to suffer 1,000 times what he's done. I've got no sympathy, none at all.
Why take young lives? Why kill innocent strangers?
It would have been nice if Ivan Milat would have, at the end of it all, explained what happened exactly and how he murdered these people.
And why inflict on their families the months and years of worry over a missing child, then the torment of the eventual reality?
If there is a hell, I don't think there'll be much question about whether he goes there or not.